Trump is not the beginning of anything new. Trump is the final endpoint of kind of 20th century politics and the slow, inexorable decline of all of the political coalitions and political identities that were built up in the 20th century. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, we needed new coalitions, new forms of government, new ways of thinking about things. But we didn't get that because the Republican and Democratic Party have a lock on money. They are the slowest moving, most kind of reactionary institutions in American life, without exception.
Hey everybody, welcome to a very special Independence Day edition of Primo Nutmeg. The 4th of July, of course, is not just a day to celebrate the United States' independence over Great Britain, but it's also a day to celebrate our individual freedoms. Because of that, my guest on the show today is Nick Gillespie, editor-at-large at the libertarian media outlet Reason. On the show today, we're going to review last week's Democratic debates. We're going to talk about Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and the other candidates in the race. We're also going to talk about U.S. foreign policy, RussiaGate, and Julian Assange. Finally, folks, we're going to discuss if a partnership between Greens and Libertarians is possible, and if someone like Jesse Ventura could be the presidential nominee for both parties. Folks, you aren't going to want to miss 1 second of this interview with Nick Gillespie. While you're listening, please remember to like, comment, and share. Also, subscribe to the Primo Nutmeg YouTube channel and follow Primo Nutmeg on social media. Also, keep in mind that Google continues to demonetize Primo Nutmeg YouTube videos. For that reason, I need your help in keeping this show going. Please visit patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg and become a patron for just $1 a month. For that $1, not only will you help support this show, but you will also get access to hours and hours of forgotten content from the earlier seasons. Thanks everyone for listening, and now without any further ado, here's my interview with Nick Gillespie. Nick Gillespie, welcome to Primo Nutmeg.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being on. You're one of those figures who I wanted to have on the show for a while. However, I think the timing of having you on today is really great because over the past 2 days, we've had the first 2 Democratic debates, and we got to hear from 20 different candidates. So overall, I just would like to know your impressions. Was there anything that really stood out for you from the last 2 nights?
You know, the short answer is no. And then let me immediately amend that by saying the one thing that was, I think, really important, and I think it will be seen down the road, not immediately as important, was Tulsi Gabbard's articulation of a principled non-interventionist foreign policy in the first Democratic debate. It was a kind of electrifying moment there. I think it's the only fully memorable event in either of the 2 debates. From a position of experience as well as a position of understanding the past 20 years of foreign policy, she said, we are doing bad things in the world that are not even working by their own, standards of success or levels of success. We need to start doing things differently. I think that's tapping into something that's really important because the Democratic Party is a place where that message needs to really take root and I think start to expand out across Democrats into the Republican Party and become a new consensus. And the American people are already there. A majority of people, growing majorities of people in polls show that they're sick of our foreign policy. They recognize, it's been years since people have recognized that both Iraq and Afghanistan were mistakes, both in conception and certainly in execution. And I think it's really great to see a major presidential candidate starting to articulate that. I think it's going to be similar to the way when Ron Paul did something similar, several presidential cycles ago, when we were still much more locked into the war on terror mentality. People were like, oh, that's the end of him. And it actually kicked off a wide discussion about things and really changed the way that the Republican Party talks about stuff.
It's interesting for me because I really became politically aware after the Iraq War and during the opposition to the Iraq War. And during that period, it seemed as though the Democratic Party was the peace party, even in the corporate media, shows like Bill Maher. I know you've been on his show many times. And there was a strong opposition to not just the Iraq War, but really broadly what the Bush administration was doing. And it seemed at the time, again, like the Democratic Party was the peace party. Since then, you had several instances during the past couple nights where there was ranting against China, against Russia, against North Korea. And Tulsi Gabbard really does seem like an outsider because she's a peace candidate. Why do you think it is that the Democratic Party in about 10 years' time have become such hawks?
Well, there's two answers to that. One is that for all of the Cold War period, and actually for all of the 20th century, basically the Democratic Party was as hawkish or more hawkish than the Republican Party. And when you think about people like Woodrow Wilson, who got us into World War II, FDR was an early proponent of joining World War II. Harry Truman in Korea, LBJ, Kennedy and LBJ in Vietnam, and the list goes on. The Democratic Party has always been hawkish, and that was the consensus for America up through the end of the Cold War, pretty much, that we were the indispensable nation. We had to be everywhere and occupy places so that the Russians didn't, and also transform parts of the world that were backwards, or making, I guess it was Wilson's phrase about making the world safe for democracy. And then what happened was when Bush went to invade Iraq, I mean, forget about Afghanistan for a second. And there was, that whole kind of hysteria, which was somewhat understandable after 9/11, when the Patriot Act was passed and the original authorization of use of military force to go after al-Qaeda and everybody who was, somehow related to 9/11. That was essentially a unanimous vote. Ron Paul and a couple of other people voted against the Patriot Act, but that was about it. And the mood of the country was in a particular place. But even for the Iraq War, Democrats overwhelmingly supported that. They supported the Iraq invasion in the early 2000s at higher levels than they did when we invaded Iraq in the early 90s. What happened was the war went poorly, and Barack Obama campaigned kind of softly as a peace candidate, which of course he turned out not to be. But that ended the anti-war movement, because the anti-war movement in America, unfortunately, and during the Bush years, it ultimately was mostly an anti-Bush movement and an anti-Republican movement. The minute a Democrat got into the White House and started doing basically the same things, among other things, Obama tripled troop strength in Afghanistan to absolutely no lasting effect on anything. He cranked up drone warfare in various places. We deposed Gaddafi in Libya, et cetera. I mean, he had a very muscular foreign policy, and the anti-war movement was nowhere to be found. And I think that's part of the problem. And that is why Gabbard, I think, is interesting, because she's bringing that back to life. And this time, it's in sync with the American people. We're done with the global war on terror. We understand that whatever was going on, it didn't work, and most of that has passed. We can deal with we can deal with terrorist acts against America and keeping America safe without having to be in every country and projecting force throughout the globe in a way that has yielded nothing, other than a completely destabilized Middle East, at this point in time.
So last night, Bernie Sanders also did deliver somewhat of a peace message. He talked about opposing the Iraq war, and also, seemed pretty dovish on Iran. He actually recently, over the past week or past couple of weeks, was one of the people who was vocally skeptical about the supposed mine that had exploded in the Gulf of Oman, saying that he didn't really believe the administration's narrative there. So overall, what do you think about Bernie Sanders' foreign policy, or at least his recent foreign policy? Do you think that he's also effectively delivering a peace message?
Yeah, I mean, and certainly I think his intentions are there. The question is whether or not this is is something that he either cares enough about or would be able to do anything about, assuming that he gets into office, which I think is unlikely that he would win in any case. But it's good to see that, and it's good to hear that, because we need. I mean, and to get to a larger question about the Democratic debate, which I'll do in a second, but we need a foreign policy reset. In the United States, we have been pursuing the same strategy in different forms now for the entire 21st century, and it's just not working. It's not yielding any results that I think people want it to yield in terms of helping the places that we invade and occupy, or allowing America to get on with living free and independent and innovative lives. It's just not working. So we definitely need that. I think the larger problem with the Democratic Party and Bernie Sanders is definitely part of the problem here, if not one of the main sources of the problem. What we saw over the past 2 days was Democratic presidential candidates saying, we're going to give you more and more stuff. We cannot afford it. We have no way of paying for it. We know that this will not work, but we are going to promise you Medicare for all. We're going to promise you free college tuition. We're going to get rid of student debt. We're going to give universal pre-K. We're going to expand the size, scope, and spending of government in all sorts of ways, while also conceivably, at least most of the candidates and most of the upper level candidates are even talking about getting rid of things like private insurance or, a private sector medical system. This is not good. And this is, in its own way, it's analogous to our foreign policy, which is a kind of top-down, large-scale, nation-building exercise that just never works out in the way that its proponents think.
I'd be interested, just because you said that you don't think Bernie Sanders has a decent shot. Going into this, it seemed like he would be the front runner, at least absent of Joe Biden joining.
Right.
But just the fact that, he did give Hillary Clinton a run for her money in the 2016 primaries. And, it's arguable if she actually kind of tilted the scales working with the DNC and state parties to effectively cheat him out of the nomination. But just I'd be interested of your analysis of his campaign. Why do you think it is that it's unlikely that he will be the nominee?
I guess I should clarify, and in this, you and me and all of your listeners, like, we all have equal insight into this stuff. It's really not, I don't think I'm bringing a huge amount of, inside information to any of this, but I think it's a couple things. One, I doubt that he's going to be the nominee, partly because the Democrats seem fixated more than anything on beating Trump, and I think Sanders, because of the socialist tag, even to the extent that people are warming up to the phrase socialist or the adjective socialist in a way that they haven't been, for any time in my life, and I'm 55. The past couple of years has been, the high watermark of socialist as a descriptor in an American context. But I think that's too much for most people, including most Democrats who are not, overwhelmingly amenable towards socialism. More importantly, they want somebody who can beat Trump. And I think there's a strong sense, and I think this is a legitimate one, even if he were the nominee, that Trump would be able to take him on and beat him. Because in a lot of ways, Trump and Bernie are, they're both populist. They both appeal to people who feel as if the system is rigged and that elites are somehow screwing them over, et cetera. And I think Trump has a better handle on on the deepest fears of Americans that will motivate them to actually come out and pull the lever in front of him. I think Trump, I said this after going to the Conservative Political Action Convention, CPAC, earlier this year, and seeing Trump work that crowd, but also give a particular version, an upbeat version of his basic speech. And I think Trump is going to be extremely difficult to beat no matter who it is.
So just to address some of the other candidates, I have to admit that going into the debates, I really didn't see the appeal of people like Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Pete Buttigieg. I didn't really get, what their appeal was, but seeing their performance in the debate, I honestly was impressed by each of them. I thought that they were competent. I thought that they were coherent. In contrast to Beto O'Rourke, who just seemed completely out of his element and lost. And
he's fading like, a T-shirt that's been washed too many times. I mean, he's just kind of fraying and falling apart. You can see right through him, which is kind of interesting. I don't think, that didn't seem like that was necessarily going to be the case. I agree with somebody like Pete Buttigieg, who, when I first met him a couple of months ago, when he was really, at the very beginning of things, and I thought he was going to be more interesting than he's turned out to be, because he seemed to be stressing, he was pushing back against identity politics in a way that was totally mindful of the different experiences that different types of people have had in America or continue to have, but also not kind of fully embracing identitarian politics, which I thought was interesting. He talks a lot about being, a capitalist, which I think is also good, and wanting to work with pragmatic solutions rather than simply ideological ones. But he's also done stuff, he's big on packing the Supreme Court, getting rid of the filibuster, putting in a national service plan. These are all things that are poison in American discourse for a lot of good reasons, I think. But it's also, I think, in this, it's not just him, but also Harris, who was terrible as the Attorney General of California. She's a real lock-em-up prosecutor, and she'd been a prosecutor before that. But, despite her record, or despite Buttigieg's positions on things, people like that, they're going to be spending so much time introducing themselves to America, they're going to be losing a lot of time spent actually kind of getting votes out. And I think, when you're looking at stuff, then it's, among the Democrats, you're going to be looking at Bernie Sanders, who's a known quantity, Joe Biden, who's very much of a known quantity, and we can talk about him in a second, and Elizabeth Warren, who's a little bit better known than the others. And I dislike Elizabeth Warren's policies almost across the board. It's hard to find, common ground with her. She's good on certain types of things, like she's talked about thinking about the decriminalization of sex work and ending the war on drugs. These are all good, but her main impulse is to put the federal government between every possible transaction, every possible exchange, economic exchange that people in America can have. And I find that genuinely frightening, but I do think it's her ideas are going to end up being, informing massively the platform of whoever runs as the Democratic nominee.
So, yeah, in terms of Joe Biden, I think that he also had a pretty bad showing last night. I think that Kamala Harris was really effective at attacking him in sort of a respectful manner, too. And I think that he didn't really have a good answer. I mean, obviously, at one point, he even said, "I'm out of time," to kind of cut the line of questioning short. I don't think it was as bad as Beto O'Rourke's showing, but I also think that this was somewhat of a loss for him.
And again, it's really it's kind of a fool's errand to handicap anything based on this these first two events, and I guess the next ones are going to be later in the fall, so that'll be when things really heat up again. And I actually think Biden did okay. He did not he didn't command the stage by any stretch, but he also showed that he was not, he's a very old man, and he had his wits with him. Part of it was, I think he was being unduly deferential to Harris, because he had also had a problem with Cory Booker, where he had kind of gone after Booker for saying many of the similar things about either racial policies, about being anti-busing in the early 70s, or being friendly with actual segregationists who were still around in the early 70s when Biden joined the Senate. He pushed back hard on Booker, and I don't think it went well, and I think that left him kind of flustered. But in another way, I think Biden is the most formidable of the Democrats, because he is, he was attached to a presidency which was controversial when it was going on, but ultimately, and particularly relative to both Bush and to Trump, the Obama years seem somewhat civil and somewhat accomplished. They're really not, and that's a problem. But I also think that Biden is conceivably the one person who could kind of absorb Trump's churlishness and kind of both push some of it back on him, but also mostly rise above it in a way that there's a lot of anti-Trump sentiment out there. I mean, I think Trump is going to win, with 45% of the vote again. He's not going to go above 50. And his whole policy, I mean, he's kind of like, when the New York Giants beat the Buffalo Bills in the Super Bowl, they were a team that couldn't really score many points against a team that had massive offense. Trump has to, he has to drag everybody down to his, into that mid 40s range. And if he wins again, and again, I at this point, I would put money on Trump being elected again, all things as they are now, but he's going to eke out another win. It's not going to be smooth sailing for him. But I think Biden actually has, kind of the broad appeal that would actually bring out the numbers and varieties of Democratic voters that need to come out in order for him to win.
So something that loomed over the debate and the Democratic Party overall recently is RussiaGate. I know that many of the candidates on at least the first debate were kind of being hawkish on China, but last night especially, you had several people mention Russia. You had them talk about how we need to strengthen our alliance with NATO. I think it was Swalwell who said make up with NATO and break up with Russia. During the first debate, you had Beto O'Rourke also talk about how Russia had invaded our democracy. I was actually a little surprised that Andrew Yang also came out against Russia. And obviously Tulsi Gabbard has been smeared as being an an Assad apologist and Russia.
Putin lover, all of this kind of stuff. And this is why Gabbard is different, I think, even than Bernie Sanders in this, is that she's not, it's one thing to be anti-war, and it's easy to be anti-Iraq at this point. Exactly how you get troops out of Syria. I mean, when Trump said, and this is also part of Trump's appeal. Remember that Trump won the presidency. He was running against Hillary Clinton, who is a huge supporter of the foreign policy of the past 20 years, who is still talking about Libya as an American intervention success story because we got rid of Gaddafi. I mean, she in her book that came out during the campaign, she talked about that as a success. It's one thing to be anti-Iraq and anti-Afghanistan and say, okay, it's time to bring the troops home. Bringing them home is much harder. But then when you start to get into these other things where people are like, well, we want a different type of American foreign policy, but we want the status quo or an even tighter relationship with NATO and with other traditional military allies, and we want to keep funding the military at current or higher levels, indefinitely. That's where Gabbard, I think, is different, and she understands, the phrase that Eisenhower put into circulation in a big way about the military-industrial complex, which is that we're not, when we talk about defense and when we talk about the military and things like that, and foreign policy, it's not simply decisions that get made. It's a large, complex system that moves in a particular direction or has a logic to it that leads to the American foreign policy that has, brought us, nothing but disaster under Bush and Obama. And in a way, Trump pushed back against that. He said to Jeb Bush on the presidential debate stage, your brother lied us into the Iraq war. And that what people were like, oh, that's Trump. That was one of those moments where Trump is finished because that was wrong and rude. And, you shouldn't say it even if you believe it. And in fact, Trump has been, he's not a systematic thinker. He's not thoughtful. I don't think he has grand visions. He has impulses. But on foreign policy, he's been better, than his immediate predecessors. This Russia question, and this is where, to go back to the Democrats, they want to talk about Russia and RussiaGate and all of this because that's a way of attacking Trump. But it's also a way ultimately of showing that they have not thought through all of the emanations of foreign policy. And one of the things that our foreign policy, we need enemy states. We need villains. We need Putin and Russia as if Russia is the Soviet Union. We need China to be the new Soviet Union. We need enemies that are military adversaries ultimately, and that we need military, alliances and military buildups and military actions in order to quarantine. And that's troubling, I think. And we saw that, over the past 2 days from most of the Democrats.
So I just would be interested in your take on how much you think that RussiaGate is going to shape the 2020 election, because I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot of the same claims that Russia is interfering. There's going to be increased scrutiny with anything that's happening on social media. Do you think that we're just really going to have a repeat of what happened in 2016 while also being cognizant or hyper focused on it the whole time that Russia is meddling in this election?
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that Russia, China, the United States, every major world power is doing this kind of stuff, and that's, we need to be cognizant of it, and we need to, in terms of kind of actual cyber assaults and things like that, we should be mindful of it. In the end, this is not going to be a primary. It's going to be a primary focus of Trump's detractors. There's no question about that, and unless something new comes out, it's not going to matter, though, and this is, for most people, and because it doesn't matter, and that's the important thing. All of the autopsies of social media and attempts by the Russians to influence social media directly influence voting, and forget about the ideas of voter fraud, of them going in and changing ballot totals. None of that happened, but the amount of social media that they got in, and the way it looked and the way it touched people, it's laughable, and nobody can really with a straight face say that Russia had any meaningful influence on the election. Maybe they'll try and amp that up, but in the end, I think people are hip to the idea that American elections are mostly, if not completely, decided by American interests and American voters and American candidates. And I think it's going to be a problem if Democrats or if anti-Trump conservatives rely too much on a RussiaGate kind of narrative, because it's going to put off more people than it's going to bring in. It might motivate people who are already anti-Trump, but it's not actually going to flip people, especially assuming, and I'm assuming, if there were smoking guns connecting Trump to Russia and being compromised in ways that would change how he's governing, we would probably know about that already. But I do think we're going to see that again and again. And this is, part of the, I one of my pet theories is that, Trump is not the beginning of anything new. Trump is the final endpoint of kind of 20th century politics and the slow, inexorable decline of all of the political coalitions and political identities that were built up in the 20th century. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, we needed new coalitions, new forms of government, new ways of thinking about things. But we didn't get that because the Republican and Democratic Party have a lock on money. They are the slowest moving, most kind of reactionary institutions in American life, without exception. And they're hanging on and they're hanging on. And now you have a Republican Party, which is in many ways a shell of itself. Fewer than 30% of Americans identify when pollsters ask them as Republicans. Who can blame them? They're this weird admixture of, social conservatism and like being hateful towards immigrants and gay people and still like kind of having to be dragged into legalizing weed and things like that American society is just so far ahead of on them. But they did have some economic chops that they destroyed under the Bush administration, where they talked a game of economic freedom and deregulation, and they jacked up spending and debt and actual regulation of the economy in various ways. And now they have a guy who is super anti-immigrant, which the Republicans weren't all anti-immigrant before Trump, but now that's a article of faith in the party, and they're anti-free trade, which was one of their bedrock issues. So. The Republican Party is this empty vessel that has been kind of commandeered by Trump, who's doing it through force of personality. But it won't, whatever his vision of the Republican Party is, it won't outlast him. And the Democrats are going through something similar, where they're still, they're talking about Medicare for all. They're talking about like Green New Deals. I mean, they're using the language of FDR in the 21st century. And it's like FDR is a long time ago, and that kind of program, that kind of spending is impossible, and it's been shown not to work. Barack Obama got everything he wanted in the stimulus package to revive the economy and bring back Keynesian economics, and we had the slowest recovery, in the history of the United States, because he was using outmoded ideas and outmoded theories, applying them in the 21st century.
One topic that was not brought up during the debates was Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And I know that this was a crucial part of the Mueller report, that Julian Assange, had played a role in the election, that he was a conduit between the Trump administration and Russia effectively. And, also this is part of this is coming up in the Roger Stone case. Tulsi Gabbard is really the only candidate who has really been outspoken about Assange. Also Mike Gravel, but he was in the debates.
Right.
And, Bernie Sanders in one tweet had alluded to the arrest of Assange and about how journalists shouldn't be persecuted, but he actually still has not said Assange's name or spoken about it. Just with this happening in the backdrop of the election, do you think that this potentially could become an issue at any point? Or do you think that it's just not going to be mentioned, in the context of the election?
Two things. One is that just on a very kind of practical, day-to-day level, it's not going to matter that much in the election. And that's Assange's day in the sun, and having supporters who are in Congress or are running the country from political offices. I think they have moved on from that, and from WikiLeaks in a certain way. So there's that. But then on a more fundamental level, and I think ultimately on a transformational level, I think everyone in the United States, and including and maybe especially journalists, we owe WikiLeaks and hence Assange a huge amount of gratitude, because what WikiLeaks did was that it helped kind of accelerate what I call forced transparency of governments and of corporations and of sources of power in our world today, by expediting the ability of people to bring to light things that governments in particular don't want their citizens to know or don't want the world to know. And it's telling that WikiLeaks did not play by the same rules as even Edward Snowden did, or past leakers, and particularly people like Daniel Ellsberg did with the release of the Pentagon Papers, giving them to major legacy media organizations that then kind of sift through them and do the work of bringing them to light. They do these document dumps. And that's powerful stuff. And like, we would not have known about so many bad things that Americans were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq if it wasn't for WikiLeaks. It's telling to me that Assange, is being charged not, I mean, the idea is that he's not a journalist, that he was actually involved in some kind of attempt to, steal documents because he kind of, egged Chelsea or, then Bradley Manning on to break a password code. This is ridiculous. I mean, Assange is as much of a whistleblower or as a repository of documents as somebody like Daniel Ellsberg. And in fact, he's less so. I mean, he's not like Daniel Ellsberg. Bradley Manning is like, or Chelsea Manning is like Daniel Ellsberg. Assange is like the New York Times or the Washington Post, as far as I'm concerned. And it's sickening to me as a journalist to see journalists saying, oh, he went too far, he didn't play by the rules, et cetera. It's like, there aren't rules here. And I hope that if and when he gets extradited to the United States, that he actually gets a fair and free trial. I don't think he should have to stand trial, but assuming that he does, I hope that he's given every aspect of due process so that we can have this discussion about what WikiLeaks has done, how they did it, and why the world is a better place. Because it is harder now for states, whether it's the United States or any other country, to kind of do horrible things and keep them hidden.
So you often talk about, as a libertarian, how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are really two sides of the same coin, and they agree on most fundamental issues, but have some disagreement on these wedge issues like abortion or guns. I kind of see the same thing happening with the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, insofar as there's agreement on ending wars, on ending domestic spying, ending the drug war, ending mass incarceration, ending corporatism. Part of the Green Party platform is also having to do with decentralization. So they're not really, big government left. They're part of what I would call the libertarian left in the tradition of Ralph Nader, Noam Chomsky. So I would just be interested in your take on the Green Party, on the libertarian left. When you look at these folks who, may skew a little bit more towards collectivist economics, but also there's such fundamental agreement on these other issues. Do you think that there is room for partnership between the libertarian right and the libertarian left?
Yeah, and I want to say I just consider myself libertarian. I use it as an adjective, or Michael Munger, an economist at Duke, has talked about directional libertarianism, where it's you're just moving towards to a place of less rule and more autonomy, less regulation and more autonomy. So I'm sometimes called, by people on the right, I'm called the left libertarian. By people on the left, I'm called a right libertarian. I don't know what that means. I'm just a libertarian without, modification. I do think there's a lot of places where the green agenda or a kind of left agenda and a libertarian agenda overlap. And that's where, that's what politics is for. It's not ultimately about agreeing on everything and then going out into the world, like, leaving the clubhouse and then going out into the world with a unanimous consent decree to do this, that, and the other thing. It's finding people where you can who agree with you on particular issues and getting things done. That's what happened with criminal justice reform, which was actually, the real energy behind that in a lot of ways was a series of very principled small government conservatives who many with evangelical or Christian affiliations pushing for criminal justice reform for a variety of reasons, and then meeting up with people in the civil rights community and people, police, groups like Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP, and whatnot, who are, a hodgepodge of right-wingers and left-wingers, but they're all former cops who recognize the drug war is bad and the drug war, fuels a kind of carceral state and all of that kind of stuff. So there's many, many places, and you outline many of them between Greens and Libertarians. The fundamental difference, though, and it is a big difference, is that I think the Green Party in general is ultimately wedded to a vision of economic control and centralization by the state, where certain things are simply not allowed, where there's a lot of regulation and control of what individuals can do, what businesses can do, et cetera. And that's always that's a gulf. That's not going to go away, but we can get there down the road, particularly when we're talking about actual politics and policy. A few years ago, Ralph Nader came out with a book, and he's worked with people like Grover Norquist of Americans for Tax Reform on various pieces of legislation. And of course, Nader, back in the day in the 70s, he, along with Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, were the architects of a vast deregulation, both of airline ticket prices, but also interstate trucking and a bunch of other things, because they felt it would help consumers, which it did help. But Nader had a book about, where kind of basically progressives and libertarians and certain types of conservatives all overlap. And if we would stop talking about first principles, we could actually get some policy changes and some new legislation. I interviewed him about that, and it was funny. Within 2 minutes, I was like, "Yeah, but Ralph, like you want a big government, blah blah blah." And he was like, "Nick, you're doing it wrong. You're playing into the larger game, which is to keep people who agree on this particular topic in front of us. This piece of legislation, which would be good for everybody, we're not going to get to have that conversation or pass that law because we're too busy fighting over first principles." So, this is part of the politics of the 21st century, is that you're not going to see, I think, and Matt Welch and I talked about this in our 2011-2012 book, The Declaration of Independence. You're not going to see long-lasting political coalitions that last for decades or generations as much as you're going to see ad hoc groups where people say, look, we agree on criminal justice reform. We agree on immigration, certain aspects of immigration reform. We agree on guns. We agree on this. We agree on that. And you come together for that moment. You get the work done, and then that coalition kind of disappears. And then some of the same people might kind of congeal around another set of topics or issues. So that, I think, is interesting, and one of the things that we need to do, I think, across the political spectrum is kind of start coming up with a language that allows for those kinds of coalitions to be built more quickly and more effectively, recognizing that they're also going to disappear after the work is done.
So it wouldn't be realistic to envision a world where Jesse Ventura, for example, would be the Libertarian and the Green Party nominee?
That's probably not. And it's also partly because these are small parties which covet their uniqueness and in some way their marginal roles and their place as as educational outlets rather than serious political parties. And you say somebody like Jesse Ventura in particular, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I think, he was a pretty successful governor of Minnesota, of a serious state and everything. He's kind of gone off the bend. So it's also like when you start to think of who would be the person who might knit these two parties together, it's not going to be Ventura. I think he's unacceptable because he's a conspiracy nut in a lot of ways, and he strays. Even when he restrains himself, he's always straining in that direction. And I don't think he would be acceptable to libertarians. I don't know about Green Party people at this point.
Well, I have been following the Green Party nomination process as well. I recently had Howie Hawkins on the show, who was a founder of the Green Party. I don't know if you've been following what's happening in the Libertarian Party. I know that Adam Kokesh is really making a run for it under the platform of abolishing the federal government once he becomes president. Adam Kokesh is really more of a voluntarist and ANCAP. I don't know if maybe you have any insight on what's happening as far as the Libertarian nomination process.
Yeah, I don't have any inside information. I mean, I think a person to keep an eye on is Congressman Justin Amash, who's from Michigan, who is a Republican who is going to be districted out of his seat. He is the first Republican to say that Trump, actually based on his reading, and he's trained as a lawyer, of the Mueller report, that Trump did engage in impeachable offenses. And to his credit, Amash, both under John Boehner as well as Paul Ryan and even Nancy Pelosi, has been, every Speaker of the House hates him because he actually is a serious constitutionalist and he wants, laws to be clear and to be debated and things like that. So he always is in hot water. But there's a lot of chatter, and he's stoked some of it, that he might run for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination, which doesn't, take place until next year. It's pretty late in the game for all of this, so there'll be stuff going on. But I'm not particularly privy to kind of Libertarian Party strategy and machinations.
Do you think that Amash's position on Russia, though, may have hurt him? I mean, I know he was kicked out of the Freedom Caucus because of that, and I think that Ron Paul type libertarians might not really embrace that part of his message. Do you think that might be a liability at all?
Yeah, he's not. I don't think he's saying that Trump is a stooge of a stooge of Putin or anything like that. But, there is something odd going on in the Republican Party and even among some libertarians that, being anti-Trump is somehow seen as, treason as opposed to following your principles. I think Amash has a very good relationship with people from the Ron Paul movement and the organizations that he's built up in the wake of that, like Campaign for Liberty and Young Americans for Liberty. So I think that Amash will do quite well among a kind of Ron Paul contingent.
Well, Nick, I really do appreciate you joining me for this edition of Primo Nutmeg. For folks out there who would like to keep following you and know the latest that's happening at Reason, how can they do that?
The best way is to go to reason.com. That's our website, and that's where our videos, we put out, hundreds of videos a year. They show up there. Our podcasts, we put out 3 podcasts a week, plus every day we're putting up, dozens of stories about everything related to kind of libertarian politics, culture, and ideas. And then people can follow me at Nick Gillespie, just my name, all one word, at Twitter. That's probably where I kind of hang out the most online. And, our subtitle or our slogan is Free Minds and Free Markets, and we're trying to figure out the ways in which we can increase individual autonomy and create a more fair, a more free, and a more innovative and fun society. That's kind of what we're doing at Reason, and we're mapping both the policies and the attitudes and mindsets and the organizations and the institutions that allow for that, and also then looking at the policies and the laws and the and the mindsets that hold us back from that kind of permissionless innovation, or what John Stuart Mill used to call experiments in living. We want to see people running as many experiments in living as possible, and we all learn from that. And we should be as free. Our starting point is that we should be as free as possible in our lives to, kind of figure out what that looks like.
Nick Gillespie, thank you very much again for joining me on this edition of Primo Nutmeg, and hopefully we can have you back at some point in the future.
I'd love that. Thanks so much for talking.